I'd like to talk about the personality disorders and what's happened in DSM-5, where it might have gone, and then where it ended up. So, first I'd like you to think about two questions. What is a personality? And then secondly, what do we mean when we think of a personality as being disordered? So if you'll bear with me, we're going to do a very brief history of personality traits. And we're going to start with Gordon Allport, who in the 1930s was one of the founding fathers of personality psychology. He taught what was probably the first course in personality at Harvard. What he did is he went through the dictionary and he found all the descriptors of what words that might apply to personality in the dictionary. And he came up with over 4,000 words. And he divided these into cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary personality traits. The cardinal traits were somewhat rare, but they were overarching kinds of personality factors. The central traits were things that organized some of the secondary personality traits. Then Raymond Cattell in the 1940s went back over Allport's list, and he used factor analysis and got the list of over 4,000 down to 16 personality factors. This is still a little unwieldy. We move from there to Hans Eysenck, who was British, and in the late 40s, early 50s, came up with what he believed were three universal traits. One is a spectrum between introversion and extroversion. The second is another spectrum between neuroticism versus emotional stability. And the third is psychoticism. Well, that was a little oversimplistic, so we went from too complicated to oversimplified. Around the same time in the late 40s, a number of people came up with what's now known as the Big Five, and perhaps that's now most associated with McCrae and Costa from the late 1980s. These are 5 personality traits. They've been studied in over 50 different cultures and found to be remarkably consistent over various cultures. What are they? Well, you can use the acronym OCEAN to think about the 5 personality traits. The first is openness, things such as imagination, insight, a broad range of interests. The second is conscientiousness. This might include thoughtfulness, good impulse control, goal-directed behaviors, organization, mindfulness of details. The third is extroversion, so harking back to Eysenck's introversion-extroversion. This is characteristics such as excitability, sociability, talkativeness, assertiveness, emotional expressiveness. The fourth is agreeableness. This personality dimension has things like trust, altruism, kindness, affection, other kinds of pro-social behaviors. And then finally, for the N, neuroticism, emotional instability, anxiety, moodiness, irritability, and sadness. So OCEAN stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So what might have been in DSM-5? There had been talk for a long time that the DSM-5 personality disorders were going to go to a dimensional scale. And one kind of dimensional scale could have been based on the Big Five, and in fact that would have made sense given that they have found remarkable consistency over different cultures. So topography of OCEAN would have had OCEAN across the x-axis, and up the y-axis there would have been some measure of amount, and there would have been a mean amount over the general population, or it might be a mean for specific subpopulations or different age groups or males versus females. And we would have one standard deviation above the mean, one standard deviation below the mean, and a person would be charted for each of those 5 big factors. We would then come up with a dimensional view of that person's personality. And maybe we would say that some frequencies or some constellations over the 5 might be considered disordered, whereas other constellations were normal. Or if everything fell within one standard deviation above and one standard deviation below, then it might be considered within normal limits. But if there are some outliers, maybe those outliers would be given different types of names, so that we would look at the overall dimensionality across the 5 rather than any single trait at one time. This is the direction that DSM-5 seemed to be going in. And for all of approximately 14 years that they were designing the DSM-5. And in fact, even as late as November of 2012, it looked like this was the direction it was going in. But there were many, many criticisms. It was a very, very radical change. It seems that the DSM task force drew back from this and went to something that looks much more like the DSM-IV than the dimensional system that I've just described. So the 5 personality dimensions in Ocean, or the Big 5, were not the building blocks for the personality disorders in DSM-IV. Instead, as you'll recall, in DSM-IV, there were 10 personality disorders, and they were put into 3 different clusters, and the characterization of the clusters did not coincide with the Big 5. If you recall, there was Cluster A, which was odd or eccentric, Cluster B, dramatic, emotional, or erratic, and Cluster C, anxious and fearful. And you'll notice that those labels don't seem to overlap with the Big 5 in Ocean. Well, there were a number of studies that were done as part of the development towards DSM-5. One of the studies went back and diagnosed clients who had been previously given a diagnosis of a personality disorder and who were in fact in treatment for a personality disorder. And so the DSM task force used research diagnostic criteria, interviewed 5,000 clients, and what they found was a 75% false positives of those who had previously been given a diagnosis of a personality disorder. For those who had previously been given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, they found an 85% rate of false positives. So this was quite alarming. This mirrors in many ways a lot of previous studies that shows that when researchers go back using RDC criteria, which are much more stringent and make sure that everybody is covering the same material in interviews, they often find a fairly high rate of misdiagnosis. However, this rate of 75% on personality disorders and 85% false positives on borderline personality disorder is higher than any other study that I've seen. So what they ended up doing was they decided to eliminate some personality disorders. They elevated the criteria for getting any of the personality disorders, and they made the process of diagnosing a personality disorder much more daunting and required much more observation and time before a diagnosis could be. So given this rate of misdiagnosis, they had several choices. They could erase all of the personality disorders. They could recluster them, perhaps along the Big 5, or they could redefine each of them. Well, they did a little of maybe everything. So the first thing they did was they redefined what is a personality. So what it was a pervasive pattern of thinking, behaving, and emotionality. And now the definition is an adaptive failure involving an impaired sense of self-identity or failure to develop effective interpersonal functioning.
So, after considering all of these changes and having told the task force to be as radical as they need to be to make some profound changes in diagnosis of the personality disorders, they did not make the kind of profound changes that many were expecting and that were published on their website for quite some time. Then it came down to considering eliminating 4 different personality disorders. Schizotypal was going to be moved to schizophrenia. Schizoid personality disorder was also going to be moved to schizophrenia, which actually didn't make sense to me because it seems like schizoid is more on the autism spectrum than on the schizophrenic spectrum. And then they were going to also eliminate histrionic personality disorder and dependent personality disorder. And after all that, what happened? Well, the Board of Trustees overturned the recommendation of the task force, and instead they retained all 10 of the personality disorders. They retained the cluster system as it is, so in essence, almost no changes whatsoever. What did they change? Amazingly enough, they removed the lower age limit. The only place you will see in the chapter on personality disorders a lower age limit for giving the diagnosis is in antisocial personality disorder, and that's because you need to have conduct disorder as before in the previous DSM in order to get the diagnosis later on of antisocial personality disorder. I do want to alert you, however, to going to Section 3 of the DSM-IV. This is where they have diagnoses for further consideration, where the more radical changes to the personality disorders are presented for further study. However, clinicians might want to look at some of those changes and be thinking about whether they would be helpful clinically in trying to understand your clients who you believe might have a personality disorder. Keeping in mind, of course, the rather high rate of false diagnosis of personality disorders as previous studies have shown.